The Silent Kingdom.
Chapter 1. The Silent Gate. The sky was painted in deep shades of gold and crimson as Elias Gray approached the kingdom's massive stone gates. A hush hung over the landscape, a silence so unnatural that even the rustling of leaves or the chirping of birds seemed absent. It was as if the world beyond these gates did not breathe. Elias had read about the Silent Kingdom in old, forgotten texts, always described as a place of mystery and secrecy. No traveler had ever returned to tell its tale, and those who spoke of it did so in whispers, as if afraid that saying its name too loudly might summon something ancient and dangerous. As he stood before the gate, a strange unease settled in his bones. No guards. No signs of life. Nothing but an unyielding silence, pressing against him like an invisible force. Taking a slow breath, he reached out and pressed his palm against the iron doors. They should have been heavy, immovable after centuries of neglect. But as soon as his fingers touched them, they swung open effortlessly. A gust of cold wind rushed past him, carrying the faint scent of something old, something long buried. Elias hesitated. Beyond the gates, the kingdom stretched before him, its white stone buildings glistening under the fading sunlight, its golden rooftops catching the last rays of the day. The streets were paved with smooth, polished stones, as if untouched by time. Yet, despite its beauty, something was terribly wrong. The people moved through the streets, men, women, children, but they walked without a sound. No footsteps. No murmurs of conversation. No laughter. They moved like ghosts, their expressions blank, their eyes either vacant or wary. Elias stepped forward, his own breath sounding too loud in his ears. The moment his feet touched the kingdom's ground, the gates behind him slammed shut. The sound of impact shattered the silence for a fleeting moment, and then, nothing. Elias spun around. The gates were closed, seamlessly sealed, as if they had never been open at all. His pulse quickened. He had entered the Silent Kingdom. And now, he wasn't sure if he would ever leave. Chapter 2. The Watchful Eyes. Elias took a hesitant step forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. The silence around him was unnatural, pressing against his ears like a thick, suffocating fog. He tried to swallow the unease clawing at his throat, but it refused to leave. The people of the kingdom moved in slow, deliberate motions, their faces void of emotion. A woman in a pale gray dress carried a basket filled with apples, yet the apples made no sound as they shifted. A group of children ran past him, their mouths open as if they were laughing, yet there was no laughter, no sound of footsteps striking the pavement. It was as if the world had been placed on mute. Elias exhaled sharply and instinctively pressed his boot against the ground, expecting to hear the crunch of gravel beneath his sole. Nothing. His own footsteps made no sound. His breathing, soundless. Even the rustling of his jacket as he moved was eerily absent. A shiver crept down his spine. This wasn't just a kingdom of silence. Sound itself had been stolen. Suddenly, a sharp sensation pricked at the back of his neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. He turned his head slowly. At the edge of the street, a young girl stood alone. She couldn't have been older than 10, her small frame dressed in a faded blue gown. Her dark hair hung in loose waves around her face, and in her hands, she clutched a bouquet of red flowers, their colors strikingly vivid against the dull tones of the city. But it was her eyes that made Elias's stomach clench. Wide, unblinking. They were not afraid, yet they held a warning, a silent plea. Elias took a cautious step toward her. "Who are you?" he tried to ask. But the moment he opened his mouth, nothing. No words, no sound. A chill crawled up his spine. The girl continued to stare at him, her small fingers tightening around the bouquet. Then, with slow and deliberate movements, she lifted something hanging around her neck, a small wooden sign. One word was carved into its surface, the letters deep and uneven, as if scratched hastily by a knife. Run! Elias's blood turned to ice. His body tensed, instincts screaming for him to listen. But before he could move, the girl's gaze shifted, not at him, but behind him. Elias felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Slowly, so painfully slowly, he turned his head. At the far end of the empty street, a figure stood in the distance. Draped in a long, black robe, its face was hidden beneath a deep hood. It didn't move. It didn't speak. But Elias could feel its eyes locked onto him. Cold, unwavering. Watching. A sickening realization settled in his stomach. This place was not empty. And he was not alone. Chapter 3. The Shadow That Follows. Elias's breath caught in his throat. The figure at the far end of the street remained motionless, its dark robe blending into the shadows of the fading twilight. But he could feel it. A presence, cold and unsettling, like a whisper brushing against his skin. His instincts screamed at him to run. But his body refused to move. The young girl still stood there, clutching her wooden sign with trembling fingers. The word carved into it, "Run," felt like a desperate warning. Elias slowly turned back toward her, his heart pounding. But the moment his eyes met hers, she was gone. His chest tightened. He hadn't looked away for more than a second. She had simply vanished. The bouquet of red flowers she had been holding lay on the ground, the petals now unnaturally withered and blackened, as if drained of life. A cold chill ran down his spine. What was happening in this place? A movement in the distance snapped his focus back to the hooded figure. It was closer now. Elias's breath turned shallow. He hadn't seen it move, hadn't heard it. But it was undeniably closer than before. A sharp panic flared in his chest. Then, something even stranger happened. The world around him shifted. The golden light of dusk flickered, as if the sun had dimmed for a brief moment. The buildings around him blurred, as though the entire kingdom had been dipped in water, its edges smearing like ink on a damp page. Then, just as suddenly, everything returned to normal. But Elias felt it. The air was heavier, thick with something unseen. The figure in the black robe remained motionless, but the feeling of being watched intensified. And then, a sound. A single sound in this kingdom of silence. A whisper. Low, haunting. Not spoken in words, but in something deeper, a presence curling around his thoughts. You should not have come. The voice was neither male nor female. It was cold, hollow, as if it belonged to the very walls of this place. Elias's hands clenched into fists. He needed to leave, now. But how? The gates had sealed shut behind him. And worse, this kingdom did not want him to leave. As he took a step backward, the figure in the distance finally moved. Slowly. Deliberately. Towards him. Elias turned and ran. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Fog. Elias ran, his boots striking the silent stone streets, yet he heard nothing. The silence of the kingdom swallowed every step, every frantic breath. It was as if he were a ghost, weightless in a world stripped of sound. He didn't dare look back. The air around him was thickening, as if unseen hands were reaching for him, pulling at his limbs. His legs felt heavy, as though the kingdom itself was trying to hold him in place. He turned a sharp corner, his breath coming in short gasps. Ahead of him, the streets stretched empty and endless. No people. No movement. Just the eerie glow of the street lamps, their flames frozen in place, unmoving. Then, the fog came. It rolled in from the edges of the kingdom, curling around buildings, spilling into the streets like a living thing. Thick, unnatural. Elias slowed, his hands outstretched in front of him as the mist swallowed his surroundings. He could barely see more than a few feet ahead. But worse than the fog were the whispers. Soft, distant voices hummed through the mist, just beyond the reach of understanding. Dozens of voices. Some desperate, some angry, some pleading. Turn back. You don't belong here. It sees you. Elias spun around, his pulse hammering. Who's there? He tried to shout. But no sound left his lips. A flicker of movement in the fog. A shape. A figure, barely visible. No, figures. Several. Their forms shifting in and out of view, as if trapped between this world and something else. Elias stumbled backward, his spine pressing against the cold stone wall of a nearby building. And then, a hand shot out from the mist. Pale, thin, fingers clawing desperately toward him. Elias's body reacted before his mind could process. He lunged away, stumbling into the fog. His pulse pounded in his ears as the whispers grew louder, overlapping, echoing through his skull. The air pressed against him, suffocating. It sees you. It's coming. Then, just ahead. A doorway. An old wooden door, barely visible through the fog. Slightly open. Elias didn't hesitate. He shoved the door open and stumbled inside. And the moment he crossed the threshold, the fog outside vanished. The whispers stopped. Silence fell once more. Elias's chest heaved. His hands trembled. He turned slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dimly lit room he had just entered. It was a library. But unlike any he had ever seen. The shelves stretched high into the darkness, packed with ancient, dust-covered books. The air smelled of parchment and something old, something forgotten. And in the center of the room, seated in a chair, watching him with knowing eyes, was an old man. Draped in long robes, his face lined with time, he held an open book in his lap. And when he finally spoke, his voice was the first sound Elias had heard since entering the kingdom. You shouldn't be here. Chapter 5. The Keeper of Lost Stories. Elias stood frozen, his breath still unsteady. The old man before him slowly closed the book in his lap, his weathered fingers tracing the edges of its ancient cover. You shouldn't be here, he repeated, his voice low and firm. Unlike the eerie silence outside, his voice carried weight, like a ripple disturbing still water. It sent a chill through Elias, not because it was threatening, but because it sounded like a warning. Elias swallowed hard. What is this place? He tried to ask. The words never formed. His lips moved, his breath left his lungs. But the silence stole his voice again. The old man sighed, as if he had expected this. He stood up slowly, the long folds of his robe brushing against the floor, and gestured toward a small wooden table beside him. On it sat a quill and parchment. Right, he said. Elias hesitated before stepping forward. His fingers closed around the quill, its feather worn with age. He dipped it into a small glass inkwell, then hesitantly scratched out a question on the parchment. Where am I? The old man read the words, then looked at Elias with tired eyes. This is the kingdom of silence, he said. A place that was forgotten by time. Elias's heartbeat quickened. Forgotten? He quickly wrote another question. Why can't I leave? The old man's expression darkened. He turned away and moved toward a bookshelf, running his fingers over the spines of the dusty, ancient tomes. Because, he murmured, the kingdom does not let people go. Elias clenched the quill tighter. That was exactly what he had feared. Something unnatural was at work in this place, something that held him here, just as it held the people outside in their eerie, emotionless silence. His gaze darted around the room. The bookshelves stretched impossibly high, their contents seemingly untouched for centuries. Then, he noticed something strange. A book lay open on the old man's table. Its pages were blank. Completely empty. Elias frowned and pointed at it. The old man followed his gaze, then exhaled slowly. These are the books of those who enter the kingdom, he said. Elias's chest tightened. What do you mean? He scribbled onto the parchment. The old man hesitated before speaking. Every person who steps into the silent kingdom has a story. A past, a life they left behind. But the longer they stay here, His fingers brushed the empty pages. The more they fade. Elias's stomach dropped. You mean, people forget? He wrote hurriedly. The old man nodded grimly. Not just forget, he murmured. They disappear, piece by piece. Their voices are the first to go. Then their memories. Then, themselves. A chill ran through Elias's veins. The blank pages. The emotionless people outside. The girl with the wooden sign. Had she been trying to warn him before it was too late? Elias's grip on the quill tightened. He refused to let this happen to him. He had to escape. Now. But as he turned to ask the old man how, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The old man's hands, they were fading. His fingers, once solid, were now half transparent, like mist dissolving into air. Elias stepped back, horror twisting in his gut. The old man smiled sadly. You see, he whispered. I've been here too long. And before Elias could react, the old man vanished, leaving behind only the open book on the table. Still blank. Still waiting. For another name. Chapter 6. The Vanishing Name. Elias staggered backward, his pulse pounding. The old man was gone, as if he had never existed. The air where he had stood was now empty. The only thing left behind was the open book on the wooden table. Elias's breathing was uneven as he slowly approached it, his fingers trembling. The pages were still blank. But something was different. At the very top of the first page, ink began to appear. Letter by letter. A name was writing itself. Elias. His blood turned to ice. His own name. Written in a book that supposedly belonged to those who could never leave. No, he whispered, though no sound left his lips. He snatched the book from the table and turned the pages frantically, hoping for an explanation, some clue on what to do. But every page was empty. The ink of his name began to smudge, as though something was trying to erase it. Elias didn't wait to find out what happened next. He turned and ran from the library. The moment he stepped outside, the world shifted. The streets, once eerily still, were now moving. Buildings breathed, their stone walls expanding and contracting as if the entire kingdom was alive. The fog had thickened. Figures stood in the mist, unmoving, watching. Elias felt their gazes on him, though he couldn't see their eyes. Shadows without faces. His heartbeat thundered in his chest. He had to escape. He turned down a narrow alley, weaving between buildings that seemed to shift and twist, making every path unfamiliar. The kingdom was changing. It was trying to keep him lost. Elias skidded to a stop when he saw a reflection in a window. His own face stared back at him. But something was wrong. His reflection was blurry, as if it were fading, as if he were fading. He reached up and touched his face. His skin felt normal, solid. But in the glass, his outline was weak, like mist dissolving into air. His chest tightened. He was already starting to disappear. If he didn't escape soon, he would become like the others. Trapped, forgotten, erased. Elias turned sharply and ran. Straight into a wall of fog. It swallowed him whole. And the world went dark. Chapter 7. The Watchers in the Fog. The fog wrapped around Elias, thick and suffocating. He couldn't see. He couldn't hear. It felt as if the entire kingdom had swallowed him whole, trapping him in an endless void. He turned in circles, his hands outstretched, searching for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was only emptiness. Then, the whispers returned. Soft at first, distant. But growing louder. He's here. He must not leave. He belongs to the kingdom now. Elias's breath hitched. The voices were everywhere. He spun around, and froze. Figures emerged from the fog. Dozens of them. Silent, motionless, watching. Their eyes, if they had any, were hidden behind the shifting mist. Their bodies were barely visible, as if they were only half real, trapped between existence and nothingness. Elias took a step back. The figures moved forward. A slow, unnatural glide, like shadows creeping closer. His pulse hammered. He had to run. But where? The fog was endless. The streets had shifted around him. He had no way of knowing which path led to safety, if safety even existed here. Then, one of the figures raised a hand. A long, thin hand, its fingers stretching unnaturally. And from the depths of the fog, something else appeared. A gate. Tall, rusted, standing alone in the mist. A way out? Elias's instincts screamed at him. It was too easy, too convenient. But the figures were closing in. The whispers grew sharper, turning into a low, echoing chant. Stay, stay, stay. Elias didn't wait. He ran for the gate. The moment he reached it, he grabbed the iron bars and pulled. It didn't budge. Locked. Behind him, the figures moved faster. The fog thickened. The whispers became a roar. Stay. Elias turned, his heart pounding. And that's when he saw it. One of the figures, closer than before. Its face, or what should have been a face, was empty. Just a hollow space where eyes, a nose, a mouth should be. A blank canvas. A figure with no identity. No name. No past. Just like he would be, if he stayed here any longer. His blood ran cold. The gate was his only chance. But how could he open it? He looked around frantically, and then he remembered. The book. The one with his name. The old man had said those who entered the kingdom lost their stories. Maybe that was the key. Elias shoved his hand into his coat pocket, feeling for the book. His fingers closed around its leather cover. He yanked it out. The blank pages fluttered wildly in the wind as he flipped to the first page. His name was still there, but fading fast. He didn't have much time. Gritting his teeth, he grabbed a small, jagged stone from the ground. And scratched his name out. The moment the last letter was gone. The gate unlocked. With a deep, metallic groan, it swung open. The fog rushed past him like a living thing, clawing at his clothes, trying to pull him back. But Elias didn't stop. He ran through the gate. And everything went black. Chapter 8. The Other Side of Darkness. Elias felt like he was falling. A weightless drop into endless blackness. His body tensed, bracing for impact, but none came. Instead, the darkness shifted around him, like thick liquid, pulling him deeper. And then, a soft glow appeared ahead. Dim at first, but growing stronger, flickering like candlelight. Elias reached for it, stretching his fingers toward the glow. The moment he touched it, the world shattered. A deafening rush of air filled his ears, and suddenly, he was somewhere else. Elias stumbled forward, struggling to adjust to the dim lighting. He was inside a massive hall. Tall stone pillars stretched into the shadows above, and ancient carvings covered the walls, stories of a kingdom lost in time. But what caught his attention was the throne at the far end of the hall. It was empty. Yet, it felt like someone was sitting there, watching. The air grew heavy. Elias took a slow step forward, his footsteps echoing. That's when he saw it. A single word carved into the throne's back. Remember. A shiver ran down his spine. What was he supposed to remember? And why did he suddenly feel like he had been here before? Chapter 9. The Echo of a Name. A gust of wind swept through the hall, whispering his name. Elias? His blood turned to ice. It sounded like a memory. Like someone he had once known, but had forgotten. The throne room darkened. Shadows pooled around the throne, shifting, moving, taking shape. A figure emerged. Tall, cloaked in flowing robes, its face hidden beneath a deep hood. But Elias could feel it. It was watching him. You came back, the figure said, its voice like a distant echo. Elias's throat went dry. "Back?" he whispered. "What do you mean? I've never been here before." The figure took a slow step forward. "Haven't you?" Elias's heartbeat thundered. Because deep down, something in him said yes. Something inside him knew this place. But how? The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the far wall. A massive mirror stood there, its glass cracked and fogged. "Look," the figure said. Elias hesitated. But something pulled him forward. When he reached the mirror, he took a deep breath. And looked. His reflection stared back at him. But it wasn't just him. There was someone else. A boy. Standing behind him. Elias spun around. No one was there. But when he looked back at the mirror, the boy was still there. And his face looked exactly like Elias. But younger. Chapter 10. A past forgotten. Elias's breath hitched. His own younger self was staring at him. But this version of him looked different. The boy in the mirror was wearing old, tattered clothes that looked like they belonged to another time. And his eyes, they were filled with fear. "Who are you?" Elias whispered. The boy didn't answer. He simply lifted his hand and pointed. Elias followed his gaze to the carvings on the wall. For the first time, he recognized them. They weren't just random symbols. They were stories. His stories. His memories. Carved into the walls of this forgotten kingdom. Elias staggered back. No, that's impossible. But the truth was sinking in. He hadn't just stumbled upon this place. He had been here before. Long ago. And somehow, he had forgotten everything. Chapter 11. The Truth Beneath the Throne. The hooded figure stepped forward. "You are beginning to understand." Elias shook his head. "No, I don't remember. I don't know what this place is." The figure was silent for a long moment. Then, it spoke. "The Silent Kingdom does not trap outsiders. It only holds those who belong to it." Elias's stomach dropped. No, that's not true. But the carvings told a different story. One of a boy who once ruled a forgotten kingdom. A boy who disappeared. A boy who returned but did not remember. Elias clutched his head. "No, that's not me. I'm not." But his own reflection in the mirror whispered back. "You are." Chapter 12. The Name That Unlocks Everything. The walls shook. The carvings glowed, pulsing with an eerie golden light. Elias fell to his knees, his mind spinning. Memories, flashes of a life he didn't know, rushed through his head. Running through the palace halls as a child. Sitting on the throne. Hearing whispers in the dark. And then, a name. A name he had forgotten. His real name. "Say it," the hooded figure whispered. Elias hesitated. If he said it, if he remembered, what would happen? Would he be free? Or would he be trapped forever? The throne shook. The walls cracked. The kingdom was waiting. Waiting for him to say his name. Waiting for him to accept the truth. Elias took a deep breath. And spoke. Chapter 13. The Name That Opens the Gate. Elias's voice trembled as he spoke the name. Alaric. The moment the word left his lips, the entire kingdom shuddered. The golden glow in the carvings flared, illuminating the throne room like fire had been unleashed within its walls. The hooded figure remained still. "At last, you remember." Elias clutched his head as more memories flooded back. Alaric. That was his name. Not Elias. Not a visitor from the outside world. He was the rightful ruler of this kingdom. But why had he forgotten? And why did the kingdom feel like it had been waiting for him all this time? The answer came too quickly. Because he had chosen to forget. A shadow swept across the room. The throne trembled. And the hooded figure finally lowered its hood. Elias's breath caught in his throat. It was himself. An older version of himself. A version that had never left. The whispers rose again, circling the chamber like the cries of the lost. The kingdom needs its king. He cannot leave. He belongs to us. Elias stumbled back. No, this isn't real. I'm not supposed to be here. The figure, his other self, stepped forward, its eyes filled with something Elias couldn't understand. You were always meant to return. The walls cracked. The throne called to him. And Elias realized with horror. If he stayed here too long, he would never leave. He had to escape. Now. Chapter 14. The Chase Through the Shadows. Elias turned and ran. The moment he moved, the kingdom shifted around him. The exit that had once been a clear path was now gone. The throne room twisted, stretching into a long, endless corridor. Torches flickered as the shadows chased him. Whispers turned to screams. Do not run. The king must not leave. Elias didn't stop. He knew now, this was a trap. The silent kingdom had been waiting for him to return. And if he allowed it, it would keep him here forever. His heart pounded as he raced through the shifting halls, desperately searching for an exit. Then, he saw it. A massive door, its frame covered in ancient symbols. The only problem? His other self was already standing in front of it. Waiting. You can't run from who you are, the figure said, voice calm but heavy with finality. Elias slowed, breathing hard. But I can choose, he said. He reached into his coat. And pulled out the book. The same book that had contained his name. The name he had erased. Only this time. It had reappeared. But something was different. Another name had been written beneath his. The one who escapes. It was a message. A choice. Elias met his other self's gaze. I choose to leave. And with that, he threw the book at the door. A deafening boom filled the hall. The symbols on the door lit up. The walls trembled. And the entire kingdom began to collapse. Chapter 15. The Silent Kingdom Falls. The throne crumbled. The corridors vanished. The sky, once hidden, split open, revealing something Elias hadn't seen in what felt like centuries. Daylight. The silent kingdom was breaking apart. His other self, the ruler that had been trapped here for so long, looked at him one last time. And smiled. You were always meant to be free. Then, he faded. The whispers died. And the fog that had surrounded the kingdom for so long vanished into nothing. Elias took one last step forward. And crossed the threshold. Elias's eyes snapped open. He was lying in the middle of the street, just outside the ruins of the silent kingdom. The sun was shining. Birds were singing. The world had moved on, but he hadn't. His hands trembled as he looked down at the old book. The last page had changed. One final sentence had been written there. The silent kingdom lives only in those who choose to remember. Elias let out a slow breath. And then, he closed the book. Leaving the kingdom behind, forever.